I never thought a quiet life on the edge of Ridgewater Bluffs would spiral into a war zone of HOA politics, but that's exactly what happened the day Karen set her sights on my barn. What began as a rustic retreat for my work quickly turned into the ultimate battleground, when the new HOA president decided my private sanctuary was her community's party hall. She showed up with binders of bogus bylaws, a smug smile, and eventually an actual key to my property she had no right to possess. From midnight threats to emergency meetings that bent every rule in the book, this woman wasn't just determined to throw a gala, she was willing to rewrite reality itself to get her way. What followed was a storm of trespassing forged maps and police sirens at dawn, and me, one furious homeowner refusing to surrender. Before we dive into the chaos, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's see how far this HOA madness reaches. The barn wasn't just another outbuilding on my property, it was the heart of everything I had built for myself. I'd spent years restoring it, laying polished wood floors, reinforcing the beams with steel, wiring it with the kind of power setup an architectural engineer needs for heavy modeling equipment. When I moved to Ridgewater Bluffs, the selling point wasn't the quiet streets or the manicured lawns. It was that barn sitting like a fortress at the back of my 5-acre lot. My office, my sanctuary. My proof that working from home could be more than just a desk shoved into the corner of a bedroom. For the first 2 years, the HOA barely knew I existed. I paid my dues, kept the lawn respectable, waved politely when I saw neighbors out walking their dogs. But the second Patricia Hale, our so-called HOA Karen, was elected president, all of that changed. Suddenly, brightly colored violation slips appeared in my mailbox like weeds. One for having grass 2 inches taller than regulation, even though I measured it myself with a tape measure and it was within the limit. Another for planting non-compliant vegetation, which turned out to be nothing more than native wildflowers I'd deliberately cultivated to bring in pollinators. At first I laughed them off. Bureaucracy has always been ridiculous, and I thought this was just Karen flexing her new authority, trying to look important. I even emailed her with polite point-by-point rebuttals, attaching photos, receipts, and clippings from the HOA's own covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and Rs. Every single time I proved her wrong. But the more I proved her wrong, the angrier she got. The first face-to-face encounter was burned into my memory. A knock on my door, 3 sharp raps, and there she was. Immaculate bob haircut binder tucked under one arm, wearing a tailored blazer that looked absurd in the sticky Virginia summer. She didn't say hello, she didn't smile. She announced like a judge reading a sentence that my barn was an unauthorized structure, inconsistent with the neighborhood aesthetic. I leaned on the doorframe, trying not to laugh. "It's been here since before Ridgewater Bluffs was even built," I said. "It's on the deed recorded at the county office. It's grandfathered in." Her chin lifted half an inch. "The structure may be grandfathered," she conceded, "but the usage is not. It is currently being used as a home office and workshop, which is inconsistent with Ridgewater's community guidelines." I gestured out toward the fields. "It's 100 yards back from the road. No neighbor can see it." "How exactly does it disrupt the community aesthetic?" She gave a little sniff, as if my words carried the odor of something unpleasant. "Regardless of visibility, all structures must adhere to guidelines. I'll need to inspect the interior to ensure compliance." That was when I knew she was dangerous, not just annoying dangerous. Because anyone who thought they had the right to march into a private building on private land under the banner of community spirit was capable of anything. I refused politely but firmly, citing the HOA's own bylaws that limited their jurisdiction to exterior appearances. Her face tightened, but she left with a stiff, "This isn't over." And she was right, it wasn't. Over the next 3 months, the violation notices multiplied. Noise complaints about power tools at night, despite my nearest neighbor being a quarter-mile away. Warnings about unapproved paint colors, even though I hadn't painted anything. I could feel the campaign building, like she was throwing darts at a wall waiting for one to stick. Each time I responded with documentation. Each time I shut her down. But then came the summer gala. Traditionally, it was held at the community clubhouse. But the clubhouse was under renovation this year, and apparently Karen had decided that my barn, my sanctuary, my workshop, the place where I kept thousands of dollars in precision equipment, would make the perfect rustic backdrop for her. 130-person soiree. I was bent over a model running calculations for a new client when the doorbell buzzed like a fire alarm. I opened the door to find Karen flanked by 3 board members, all in matching Ridgewater Bluffs polo shirts, arms crossed like backup singers to her solo act. "Good news, Mr. Carter," she said, stepping past me without invitation. The board has decided to grant you an exemption for any potential violations related to your barn. There were never any violations, I corrected. In exchange, she continued, as if I hadn't spoken, for allowing us to use your barn for this year's summer gala. It's perfect. 130 guests, a charming country chic theme, wonderful optics for the community newsletter. I blinked at her. You want to use my private workshop for a party, the community party, she said, plastering on a smile. You are part of the community, aren't you? Or are you suggesting you don't care about community spirit? The board members behind her nodded solemnly, like they were in on some kind of sacred ritual. I kept my voice calm. I have deadlines. My equipment is set up. I can't risk it being damaged. Karen's smile hardened, though her lips didn't move. Perhaps I didn't make myself clear. Cooperation tends to make community living more harmonious. The gala is in 3 weeks. We'll need access the day before to decorate. I'll check back next week for your answer. She thrust a paper into my hand and swept out the door, her entourage trailing behind. I stood there staring at the so-called formal request, my blood boiling. I knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't a request. It was blackmail disguised as neighborliness. Give us what we want, and we'll stop harassing you. That night I stayed up until 2 a.m. reading every single line of the Ridgewater Bluffs bylaws. And when I finished, I knew 3 things for certain. 1, there was no clause that gave them the right to commandeer my property. 2, every retaliatory violation she'd thrown at me was useless in court. And 3, I was about to become the one man in this neighborhood who refused to kneel to Karen. When I woke up the next morning, the so-called formal request was still lying on my kitchen counter. The paper was printed on Ridgewater Bluffs letterhead, complete with the HOA's logo, a tree inside a shield, ironic in a neighborhood where most of the old trees had been cut down to make way for uniform lawns. In bold text, it stated that the board had approved the use of my barn as the official venue for the summer gala. Approved. As if my home office were a public park, they could just reserve at will. I folded the paper, neatly placed it in a folder, and drove into town to see my old college friend, David Morales. David wasn't just any lawyer. He specialized in HOA disputes. Over coffee, I laid out the situation from the fake violation notices to this new request. He read the document carefully, then smirked and slid it back across the table. They're bluffing, he said. There's no legal foundation for this. They can't force you to host anything. If they retaliate with fake violations, that's harassment, and you'd have grounds for legal action. Document everything. Keep your emails, letters, even their violation slips. If she's reckless enough to push further, you'll be holding all the cards. I exhaled in relief, but David leaned closer. Just know this, some HOA presidents thrive on intimidation. They don't stop until you draw a line. So you need to be firm, clear, and absolutely consistent. That night, I drafted an email addressed to the entire board. I was professional but direct. I cited the bylaws word for word, underlining the sections limiting the HOA's jurisdiction. I reminded them that private property could not be commandeered for community events. I warned that any retaliation would be documented and treated as harassment. I sent the email at midnight, so when they woke up the next morning, it would be waiting in their inboxes like a landmine. For a few days, the neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet. I thought maybe the board had realized they'd overstepped. But when the knock came again 3 days later, I knew better. Karen was back. She had the same binder, only this time it looked even thicker. Her blonde bob was perfectly set, and she wore a smile that could curdle milk. "Mr. Carter," she said sweetly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." I made my position clear, I replied, holding the doorframe just as I had before. "This isn't about positions," she continued, stepping closer. "It's about harmony. Several neighbors have complained about the noise from your barn power tools hammering late into the night. Very disruptive." I almost laughed. My nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile away, and I rarely work past 6. Her smile never wavered. "Be that as it may, perception is important. Now, we wouldn't want those complaints piling up, would we?" Her words weren't subtle. They were a threat in silk, rapping, "Give us your barn or we'll bury you in fabricated complaints." "File them formally," I said evenly. "I'll be glad to respond through proper channels." Her smile twitched just slightly. Then she handed me another sheet of paper, this one titled Community Cooperation Agreement. "The gala is in 3 weeks. You'll need to confirm by the end of the week so we can finalize invitations. One way or another, the gala will happen." And with that, she turned and walked briskly down my driveway, her heels clicking like hammers on concrete. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat in my barn surrounded by the hum of my machines staring at the blueprints I'd been working on. The barn smelled faintly of cedar and oil, familiar and comforting, but I couldn't shake the image of Karen marching through with 130 guests, champagne flutes clinking against my drafting table. I tightened my grip on the phone and called David again. "She's escalating," I told him. "Now she's inventing complaints." "Expected," he said. "Look, Evan, this is classic HOA bullying, but the law is on your side. If she keeps pushing, she'll bury herself. Just don't cave." The following week, the board sent out a community newsletter. Right on the front page was a full-color announcement: Ridgewater Bluffs Summer Gala, hosted at the historic Carter Barn. My barn. My name. Without my consent. Neighbors waved at me a little too cheerfully when I drove past, some even congratulating me for offering the barn. It was surreal. Karen had pre-written the narrative, counting on me to fold under the social pressure of 130 expectant residents. But folding wasn't an option, so I went deeper. I spent evenings researching not just the HOA bylaws, but also state property laws. Virginia courts had ruled repeatedly against HOAs that overstepped into private property rights. I bookmarked cases where homeowners had sued and won damages for harassment, trespassing, and fraudulent violations. I started a file, Karen evidence, with every email, every letter, every newsletter clipping. I was building my defense, but more importantly, I was building a trap. One night, as the cicadas buzzed outside, I stood in the barn doorway staring out across the dark fields. The gala was just 2 weeks away, and Karen was running out of time. I knew her type. She wasn't the kind to admit defeat. No, she'd push harder. She'd bend rules, twist maps, maybe even try something reckless. And when she did, I'd be ready. The battle lines were drawn: her arrogance versus my stubbornness, her threats versus my documentation. This wasn't just about a barn anymore. It was about principle. About standing firm when someone tried to turn your home into their playground. What I didn't know then was how far Karen would actually go, or how close she'd come to breaking the law in ways that would finally destroy her reign. I was right. Karen wasn't the type to give up. A week before the scheduled gala, I received an email with the subject line, "Emergency Board Resolution, Immediate Effect." My stomach sank as I opened it. Inside was a single-page document signed electronically by Karen and 2 other board members. It stated that due to urgent community needs, the HOA had reclassified certain adjacent structures as community use facilities for the duration of the gala. Attached was a plot map showing my property line mysteriously shifted about 30 feet, conveniently placing the barn within what they now claimed was a community easement. It was laughable if it hadn't been so brazen. The map looked like it had been edited by a child with a copy of Microsoft Paint. Property lines were crooked, the text labels didn't match the county's survey format, and the HOA seal was pasted into the corner like a cheap watermark. Yet there it was, their official attempt to rewrite reality. I forwarded the email to David immediately. He called me within 10 minutes, his voice tight with fury. "This is fraud, Evan. Flat-out fraud. They can't hold an emergency meeting without notice to members, and they sure as hell can't redraw property lines. That's the county's job, not theirs." "Tell me something I don't know," I muttered, pacing my living room. "What I can tell you," he continued, "is that this letter is your silver bullet. Print copies, save them to the cloud, back them up. If they push this into court, that map alone will sink them. I'll draft a cease and desist tonight." True to his word, David emailed me a 3-page letter within hours. It was written in the kind of sharp legalese that left no room for interpretation. The HOA was to cease all attempts to reclassify my property, retract their fraudulent documents, and refrain from further harassment. Failure to comply would result in immediate legal action. The next morning, I hand-delivered a copy of the letter to every board member's mailbox. It felt like sliding a grenade pin into place. Now, all I had to do was wait for the explosion. 2 days later, it came. I was working in the barn when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Looking out the window, I saw 3 SUVs parked near the entrance. A group of people bustled around the vehicles, unloading boxes and decorations. And there, standing in the middle like a general commanding her troops, was Karen. She wore a wide-brimmed sun hat and carried a clipboard, barking orders as volunteers scurried to obey. I stormed out of the barn, the cease and desist letter clutched in my hand. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted. Karen turned, her face lighting up with that infuriatingly smug smile. "Setting up for the gala, of course. Didn't you get the notice? The board voted unanimously." I held up the letter. "You also got this from my attorney. You are trespassing on private property. Leave. Now." She waved her hand dismissively as if shooing a fly. "Your threats don't scare me, Mr. Carter." The revised easement clearly places the barn under HOA jurisdiction. The revised easement I snapped is a forgery. You don't have the authority to redraw county records. Remove yourselves before I call the police. One of the volunteers, a man I recognized as Jim, the HOA treasurer, shifted uncomfortably. Patricia, maybe we should talk this over. If he has a lawyer, oh, stop being spineless. Jim Karen cut him off. He's bluffing. The police always side with the HOA. I pulled out my phone and started dialing. Try me. Karen's eyes glittered. Go ahead, she sneered. You'll just embarrass yourself. And then with theatrical flair, she snatched a set of keys from another volunteer and strode toward the barn. My stomach dropped. How do you have those keys? I demanded. She ignored me, sliding one into the lock. To my horror, the door swung open. I would later learn she had convinced the neighborhood handyman who'd once helped fix my garage door that I had authorized a duplicate key for emergency HOA access. It was a lie, but he had believed her. Let's get these decorations inside while Mr. Carter wastes everyone's time, Karen declared, sweeping into my barn. 2 volunteers followed, carrying boxes of string lights and tablecloths. I was shaking with rage, but I knew I had to keep my head. I pressed call and spoke into the phone as calmly as I could. Yes, this is Evan Carter. I need police dispatched immediately. I have unauthorized persons trespassing on my property. They've broken into a locked building and are refusing to leave. While I waited for the patrol car, more volunteers arrived, lugging coolers and folding chairs. Inside my barn, I could see Karen directing them to move my drafting table and cover my equipment with tablecloths. Every scrape of metal against wood felt like a violation. Every laugh from the volunteers like a nail in my skull. 20 minutes later, salvation arrived in the form of flashing lights. Officer Rodriguez, a level-headed man I'd met once at a neighborhood safety meeting, stepped out of his cruiser. Mr. Carter, he said, we received your call about trespassers. Can you explain the situation? I handed him my property deed, the cease and desist letter, and a copy of the fraudulent easement map. He listened carefully, nodding, then walked over to Karen. I couldn't hear their entire exchange, but Karen's voice carried across the driveway. This is a community facility now. The board voted he's being unreasonable. Rodriguez's voice was calmer, firmer. Ma'am, the county deed shows this as private property. Until a court says otherwise, that stands. He's asked you to leave. That means you need to leave. Most of the volunteers hesitated, glanced at each other, and began gathering their things. Karen, however, stood her ground, face flushed with fury. This is ridiculous. One way or another, this gala will happen here. You'll regret this. Rodriguez didn't budge. Ma'am, either you pack up now, or we'll consider criminal trespassing charges. Your choice. For a moment, I thought she might actually defy him. But finally, with a guttural growl, she spun on her heel and stormed toward her SUV. As she passed me, she hissed, "This isn't over, Carter." Not by a long shot. I stood there shaking as the last car pulled away. The barn smelled of sweat and cardboard, my tools shoved haphazardly to the side. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd won a battle. Little did I know the war was just beginning. The night after the police ordered them off my property, I barely slept. I kept replaying the image of Karen sliding that fraudulent key into my barn door, walking in as if she owned the place. Every creak of the house set my nerves on edge. I finally gave up on sleep around 3 a.m. and sat in the barn, scrolling through security camera catalogs on my laptop. By sunrise, I had ordered a full set of motion-activated cameras with cloud backup, and I'd called a locksmith to change every lock on the barn, garage, and house. If Karen thought she could waltz into my sanctuary again, she was in for a surprise. The locksmith arrived by mid-morning. He was an older man named Paul, and when I explained why I needed every lock swapped out, he gave a low whistle. HOA trouble, huh? I see it all the time. People think those boards are kings of the neighborhood. They're not. This is your land. Don't let them bully you. By the time he left, every door had a new lock, each stamped with "Do Not Duplicate" across the keys. It wouldn't stop a determined criminal, but it would stop Karen, or so I thought. That afternoon, I sat at my desk drafting a formal complaint to the county sheriff's office. I wanted what had happened on record, not just as a police incident report, but as potential evidence in the event of a lawsuit. I attached photos of the fraudulent easement map, copies of every violation notice, and the cease and desist letter. When I hit send, I felt a surge of relief. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was building a case. Saturday morning, my phone buzzed with a security alert. I tapped the app and froze. The camera feed showed Karen standing at my barn door again, this time with 2 catering staff behind her. She yanked at the new lock, shoved her key in, and when it didn't turn, she started pounding on the door. I stormed outside, phone in hand. "Can I help you?" I called, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. She whirled around, eyes blazing. "You changed the locks. How dare you? How dare I secure my own property?" I shot back. "You trespassed yesterday. You were ordered off my land. And now you're back." Her face twisted with rage. "The gala starts in 4 hours. We have nowhere else to go. You have to let us in." "I don't have to do anything," I said evenly. "Especially not for someone who forges maps and steals keys." "You'll regret this," she spat. "I'll make sure of it." One of the caterers cleared his throat nervously. Miss Hale, we've got ice sculptures melting in the truck. If we don't start setting up soon," Karen snapped her head toward him. "We'll set up in the cul-de-sac, on Maple Drive. Now." The caterers exchanged uneasy glances, but obeyed. I stood there on the gravel, arms crossed, as Karen barked orders and stomped off, heels clicking furiously. By noon, the chaos was in full swing. From my front porch, I could see folding tables and tents sprouting across Maple Drive like mushrooms after a storm. Cars lined both sides of the street, blocking driveways. Guests arrived in cocktail attire, bewildered by the makeshift venue. And sure enough, before long, red and blue lights flashed again. 2 police cruisers pulled up, and officers began dispersing the crowd. Neighbors argued, guests complained, and Karen screamed herself hoarse, insisting she had permits. She didn't. Within an hour, the street was cleared, the tents dismantled, and the gala dissolved into a disaster. I might have felt a flicker of pity for her if she hadn't brought it entirely on herself. But as I watched from my porch sipping coffee, all I felt was grim satisfaction. The following day, a knock came at my door. I checked the camera first, fool me once, and saw Jim, the HOA treasurer, standing alone. He looked nervous, hands stuffed in his pockets. I opened the door cautiously. "Mr. Carter," he began, "I just wanted to apologize. I never would have gone along with Patricia if I'd known she was lying about having your permission. Yesterday was, well, a disaster. The police were called, and several residents are furious." I folded my arms. "Not my problem." "Right," he agreed quickly. "But the board is holding an emergency meeting tomorrow to address Patricia's conduct. Several of us feel she's exposed the HOA to legal liability. We'd like you to attend, to tell your side, and to show your evidence." I hesitated. "And why should I trust that it won't just be another ambush?" "Because," Jim said quietly, "you're not the only one. Other homeowners are coming forward. Patricia's been falsifying records for years. This isn't just about your barn, it's about how far she's willing to go to stay in control." That caught my attention. If Karen had a pattern of abuse, then exposing her wouldn't just protect me, it could protect everyone in Ridgewater Bluffs. "Fine," I said. "I'll be there. But I'm bringing my lawyer." Jim nodded, visibly relieved. "That's probably a good idea." As he walked back down the driveway, I felt the first real shift in the battle. For weeks, I'd been fighting Karen alone. But tomorrow she would face not just me, but an entire room of people she had bullied, intimidated, and lied to. And this time, I wouldn't just defend my barn. I'd expose her reign for what it truly was, a fraud propped up by fear. The next morning, Ridgewater's clubhouse conference room looked like a courtroom preparing for trial. Word had spread quickly after the Gala fiasco. The place was packed, not just with board members, but also with homeowners, curious to see whether Patricia Karen Hale would finally face consequences. I arrived early with David, my attorney, who carried a thick folder of documents. His calm confidence was contagious, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the scales tipping in my favor. The board sat at a long oak table at the front, with Jim the treasurer nervously arranging papers, and Susan, another board member, scrolling through her laptop. The air buzzed with whispers, the kind that always precedes something big. At exactly 10 o'clock, Patricia walked in. She was late, as if to remind everyone she believed herself untouchable. She wore a crimson suit jacket that screamed authority, though the effect was undermined by the fact that she looked rattled, her hair slightly, frizzed, her makeup a shade too heavy to hide the fatigue. She froze when she saw me seated with David in the front row. For the briefest moment, her mask slipped, but then she plastered on that trademark smile and marched to the head of the table, as if nothing were amiss. Jim cleared his throat. "This emergency meeting has been called to address concerns raised by residents and board members regarding President Hale's conduct. Several homeowners have submitted complaints, and today we'll hear testimony." Patricia adjusted her blazer and spoke before anyone else could. "Let me just say, everything I've done has been for the good of Ridgewater Bluffs. Sometimes leadership requires tough choices. I understand some may not like the methods, but the results speak for themselves. Our property values are up, our streets are orderly, and our community spirit is strong." Murmurs rippled through the room, but they weren't murmurs of agreement. Susan spoke next. With all due respect, Patricia forging easements and entering private property without consent is not leadership, it's misconduct. Patricia's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. That's a gross exaggeration. I was acting under board authority. The barn was practically part of the community. That was my cue. David stood handing out copies of the fraudulent map and the cease and desist letter. Ladies and gentlemen, here are the facts. The county deed shows Mr. Carter's barn sits entirely on private property. This doctored map, he held it up for everyone to see, was created by President Hale to justify seizing a venue for her party. That is fraud. Add to that the unauthorized key duplication, the trespassing, the harassment through fabricated violation notices, and you have a pattern of abuse that exposes not only her, but the entire HOA to serious legal liability. The room erupted. Homeowners shouted over one another, some demanding answers, others gasping in disbelief. Jim banged a gavel to restore order. One by one, residents began to stand and share their stories. An elderly couple described being fined for having a flagpole that was too tall, even though it met the guidelines. A young family said Karen had ordered them to remove their children's playset because the colors clashed with neighborhood aesthetics. Another homeowner revealed she'd been threatened with foreclosure over a $50 late fee that had already been paid. By the time it was my turn, the atmosphere was electric. I walked to the front of the room, the eyes of 50 neighbors on me, and spoke as plainly as I could. This barn is my sanctuary. Patricia tried to take it not for the community, but for her own ego. She lied, forged documents, and trespassed. If I hadn't fought back, she'd still be in there today, turning my livelihood into her party hall. And next time it won't be me, it'll be one of you. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. Then Susan stood. I moved that we take an immediate vote of no confidence in Patricia Hale as HOA president. The motion was seconded instantly. Karen's eyes widened. You can't do this to me, she snapped, her voice rising. I am Ridgewater Bluffs. Everything you have is because of me. This is mutiny. Jim's voice was steady. It's democracy. Hands shot up across the table. Every board member voted yes. Even Karen's usual allies turned against her. It was unanimous. Jim stood, his voice formal. By unanimous vote of the board, and in accordance with Section 7.3 of our bylaws, Patricia Hale is hereby removed as president and board member of Ridgewater Bluffs, effective immediately. Please surrender all HOA records, keys, and access cards. The room broke into applause. Some cheered. Others just sighed in relief. Karen, however, erupted. She slammed her fists on the table, knocking over a glass of water, and shouted, "You'll regret this, all of you. I built this neighborhood. You can't strip me of my power." Security, already on standby, moved forward. She resisted, screaming, insults, her voice cracking with desperation. As they escorted her out, her last words echoed through the clubhouse. "This isn't over. You'll all pay." But in that moment, she was finished. David leaned toward me and whispered, "Congratulations. You didn't just defend your barn, you toppled a tyrant." And though part of me knew Karen wasn't the type to disappear quietly, I allowed myself a moment of triumph. For the first time in months, Ridgewater Bluffs felt lighter, freer. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging thought, people like her don't go down without plotting a comeback. When Patricia was voted out, most of the neighborhood celebrated as if a dictator had finally been toppled. But deep down, I knew she wasn't finished. People like her don't simply vanish. They plot, they scheme, and they look for cracks in the wall to crawl back through. For a few days, everything seemed calm. No violation slips appeared in my mailbox. No SUV slowed down in front of my driveway. The barn, locked and secured with new cameras, felt safe again. Yet my instincts told me it was the quiet before another storm. The first ripple came in the form of an email. The subject line was grandiose, "Cease and desist," from the office of Patricia Hale. My eyebrows shot up before I even opened it. The letter was written on what looked like official law firm letterhead, but something about it smelled off. It accused me of defamation, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and demanded that I apologize publicly while paying her damages. I laughed out loud. But then I noticed the address on the bottom, nothing but a UPS mailbox number. I forwarded it to David, my attorney, and called him. He chuckled as soon as he saw it. "Evan, this isn't from a real law firm. It's a scare tactic. She probably whipped this up on her home printer." "Don't lose sleep over it." "Don't lose sleep," I said, pacing the barn. "She forged maps, stole keys, tried to break in twice, and now she's sending fake legal letters." "What's next?" "What's next," he replied calmly, "is that she's running out of moves. She'll try to bluff you with noise, but every card she plays makes her look more desperate. Just keep documenting. If she ever drags you into court, she'll be the one exposed." That was reassuring, but I still couldn't shake the unease. 2 days later, Jim, the HOA treasurer, knocked on my door. His hands fidgeted as he spoke. "Evan, we've started auditing the books. It's worse than we thought. Patricia's been skimming money for years. Landscaping contracts, inflated checks written to companies owned by her cousin, even direct reimbursements to herself without approval. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars." My jaw tightened. "So, it wasn't just power trips, it was greed." Jim nodded gravely. "Control and greed go hand in hand. She covered her tracks, but after the Gala fiasco, we had reason to dig deeper. We're bringing in a forensic accountant." That night, I couldn't focus on my blueprints. Instead, I walked the property line with a flashlight, making sure every gate was locked, every camera angled properly. I stopped at the barn door, running my hand along the heavy oak. It wasn't just wood and nails anymore, it was a symbol of refusing to bend to intimidation. But I also knew symbols attracted battles, and Patricia wasn't one to give up a battlefield easily. Sure enough, a few mornings later, a white pickup truck with a county seal pulled up. 2 officials in reflective vests got out, clipboards in hand. I stepped outside to meet them. "Morning, sir," one said politely. "We're here to inspect a complaint about unauthorized construction in this barn. Apparently there are concerns it doesn't meet safety codes." I almost laughed. "Let me guess, filed by a Miss Patricia Hale." The 2 men exchanged a glance. The complaint was filed anonymously. "We don't see names, just says, concerned resident." I didn't hesitate. I walked them into my office and handed over a thick binder. My deed, the original county, permits photographs of the barn's restoration and documentation, showing it had been grandfathered in decades ago. They flipped through it, nodding. After 15 minutes, the taller one closed the folder. "Everything looks in order. We'll close the file. Sorry for the trouble, sir." "No need to apologize," I said, though my blood simmered. Patricia was clearly trying to weaponize the county against me. That evening, Susan from the board called. "Evan, we're drafting new bylaws to prevent abuses like Patricia's. We'd like your input." "Count me in," I said immediately. Over the next week, I poured hours into drafting proposals. Mandatory transparency for financial records, clear limits on emergency meetings, explicit prohibitions against entering or attempting to access private property without the owner's consent. If the HOA was going to exist, it needed teeth, but not the kind Patricia had sharpened to cut down her neighbors. But Patricia wasn't done slinging mud. One neighbor forwarded me a screenshot from Facebook. Patricia had created a private group called Save Ridgewater's Spirit. In it, she painted herself as the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by me. She claimed I was a selfish outsider poisoning the community with lies, and she urged her followers to fight back against corruption. I scrolled through the comments, my jaw tightening. A few loyalists cheered her on, but most residents pushed back. Some called her delusional. Others demanded proof. The tide of opinion had turned against her, but she was still clawing at the walls. David's mantra echoed in my head, document everything. So I did. Screenshots, dates, times, even the usernames of her dwindling band of supporters. Because Patricia wasn't just an enemy anymore. She was evidence. Evidence of how power left unchecked can rot a community from within. Standing in my barn that night, security cameras humming quietly overhead, I stared out at the fields. The sun was setting, casting streaks of orange and gold across the horizon. The barn glowed in the fading light, a fortress that had survived every storm Patricia had thrown at it. But I knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. People like Patricia didn't vanish quietly. They came back louder, wilder, more desperate than before. And when she did, I intended to be ready. For a brief moment after Patricia's removal, Ridgewater Bluffs felt almost normal. The tension that had hung in the air like a storm cloud began to dissipate. Neighbors smiled again, children played in their yards without parents worrying about aesthetic violations, and I finally worked in my barn without the nagging dread of a neon-colored slip taped to my mailbox. But calm in this neighborhood never lasted long, and with Patricia I knew it was only a matter of time before the other shoe dropped. That time came quicker than expected. The HOA board announced a special community meeting to present the results of their audit. By then, whispers were already circulating. Patricia hadn't just abused her power, she'd lined her pockets. I arrived at the clubhouse early with David, my attorney, but the room was already buzzing. Residents crammed into folding chairs, some standing along the walls, everyone eager to hear the truth laid bare. Jim, the treasurer, opened the meeting with an uncharacteristic firmness. "Tonight," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "we will present our findings regarding the financial conduct of former President Hale. What we discovered is troubling. and the community deserves to hear it. Susan, seated beside him, pulled out a thick report. Her tone was calm, but her words cut like a knife. Over the last 4 years, more than $40,000 of HOA funds have been misused or misappropriated. Landscaping contracts were inflated by as much as 50%. Payments were made to companies owned by Hale's relatives, and in multiple instances, she wrote checks to herself under the guise of reimbursements without board approval. The room erupted in gasps and angry mutters. One man shot to his feet. "She fined me $300 for a garden gnome, all the while she was stealing our money." Another resident shouted, "She threatened to put a lien on my house over a late fee, and she was robbing us blind." Susan raised her hand for silence, though her own jaw was tight with anger. "We have already contacted county authorities. A forensic accountant is assisting us, and if necessary, law enforcement will be involved." Patricia's actions are not just violations of trust, they may constitute crimes. That's when the doors banged open. Patricia stormed in her heels, clicking like gunshots on the linoleum floor. Her crimson jacket was rumpled, her makeup thick, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. Murmurs swept the room as she strode to the front like a general rallying her troops. "This is a witch hunt," she screeched, pointing at the board. "Lies and exaggerations designed to ruin me. I gave this neighborhood structure, order, pride. And this is how you repay me." Jim remained seated, though his knuckles whitened on the table. "Patricia, you have no standing here. You were removed by unanimous vote." She slammed a fist onto the table, scattering papers. "You think you can silence me? I built Ridgewater Bluffs. Without me, you'd all be drowning in weeds and junk cars." Her gaze swept the room before locking onto me. Her finger shot out like a dagger. "This is his fault. The outsider. He poisoned you against me." Dozens of eyes turned toward me. My pulse quickened, but I stood calmly, my voice steady. "You did this to yourself, Patricia. I didn't forge documents. I didn't trespass into other people's homes. I didn't siphon money from my neighbors. You did." Her face twisted. She lunged toward the stack of audit reports, grabbed them, and flung the papers into the air. They fluttered down like confetti landing at the feet of stunned residents. "You'll regret this," she howled. "Every last one of you," security already anticipating trouble moved in. Patricia fought them every step, shrieking curses, clawing at the air as they guided her toward the door. Her voice cracked with desperation, but the venom was still there. "You think this is over? I'll sue you all. I'll tear this neighborhood apart brick by brick." The doors slammed shut behind her. Silence blanketed the room, broken only by the soft rustle of papers settling on the floor. Then, almost tentatively, someone began to clap. Another joined in. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, applauding not just for the board, but for themselves, for finally breaking free of Patricia's chokehold. Jim rose again, his voice firm, despite the chaos. "Residents of Ridgewater, this is a turning point. We will rebuild trust. We will pass new bylaws to ensure transparency, accountability, and respect for private property. Ridgewater Bluffs will never again fall under the rule of fear." People lined up afterward to shake my hand. A young mother thanked me for standing up when others were too scared. An elderly man, his eyes moist, whispered, "You gave us courage, son." Their gratitude was humbling, but I reminded each of them I hadn't fought alone. They had stood with me in that room, and together we had stripped a tyrant of her crown. Driving home headlights, cutting through the quiet suburban streets, I felt a sense of victory tempered by caution. Patricia's final words echoed in my head, "This isn't over." No, it wasn't. She was bruised, humiliated, and cornered people often fight hardest. Still, as I parked in front of my barn and looked at it bathed in silver moonlight, I allowed myself a small smile. Patricia might come back swinging, but this time, the neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. We had faced her, exposed her, and cast her out. For now, Ridgewater Bluffs was free. In the days after Patricia's public meltdown, Ridgewater Bluffs felt transformed. It was like someone had opened the windows in a stale room, letting in fresh air and sunlight. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact at the mailbox now lingered to chat. Children played basketball in driveways without parents nervously scanning the street for HOA patrols. The fear that had hung over the community like a fog was finally dissipating. But for me, the battle wasn't just about relief, it was about closure. I knew that unless the board took concrete steps to secure the neighborhood against future abuse, Patricia or someone like her could one day rise again. The new interim board wasted no time. Jim and Susan invited me to a planning session at the clubhouse. Around a long wooden table, they spread out draft proposals for new bylaws. First, Susan said, "We need financial transparency. All expenditures must be logged, accessible to members, and approved by more than one officer." Second, Jim added, We're limiting emergency meetings. No more of Patricia's midnight votes. Notices must be given at least 72 hours in advance, except in genuine safety emergencies. I leaned forward. Add language that explicitly prohibits board members from entering or attempting to access private property without the owner's consent. What happened to me can never happen again. They both nodded. It felt strange sitting at that table helping to reshape the rules of the very HOA I'd once despised. But maybe that was the irony. Sometimes the only way to defeat a system was to change it from within. Meanwhile, Patricia was unraveling. Screenshots of her Facebook group, Save Ridgewater's Spirit, spread like wildfire. Most residents mocked her posts, but a handful of loyalists fanned the flames. She claimed she'd been ousted by a cabal of liars, that I had weaponized the law against her, and that she would soon return with lawyers and real justice. David, my attorney, wasn't worried. She has no case, Evan. Every move she makes just piles more evidence in your favor. Still, I stayed vigilant. Cameras rolled day and night, and I saved every email, every post, every half-baked threat. One evening, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Jim carrying a manila envelope. He looked tired but satisfied. "We filed a formal report with the county," he said, "and you might want to see this." Inside were copies of the audit's final pages. Patricia hadn't just inflated landscaping costs, she'd diverted HOA funds into a shell company registered under her own name. The scale of it was staggering, tens of thousands of dollars stolen under the guise of community improvements. "This is embezzlement," I said quietly. Jim nodded. "Law enforcement agrees. The county prosecutor's office is reviewing the case." I sat back stunned. Patricia had been more than a petty tyrant with a clipboard. She'd been running a racket in broad daylight. The fines, the violations, the pressure campaigns, they weren't just about control. They were a smokescreen for theft. 2 weeks later, the news broke. Patricia had been formally charged with fraud and embezzlement. The community buzzed with shock, but for many it felt like long overdue justice. The day the sheriff's deputies showed up to escort her out of her McMansion at the edge of the neighborhood, I stood quietly on my porch watching the convoy of vehicles pass by. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I just felt an overwhelming sense of finality. That night, I walked out to the barn. The crickets chirped, the air was cool, and the oak door gleamed under the porch light. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and sat at my drafting table. The barn smelled faintly of sawdust and oil, exactly as it always had, but something felt different. It wasn't just a sanctuary anymore, it was proof. Proof that standing firm mattered. Proof that bullies could be defeated when the truth was stronger than their lies. The next morning, the board issued a formal letter of apology to me and to the entire community. They pledged to reimburse residents for illegitimate fines and to establish a legal defense fund to protect homeowners from future abuses. For the first time since moving to Ridgewater, I felt proud to live there. And yet, I couldn't help but think of Patricia's final, desperate words. This isn't over. Maybe she still believed she could claw her way back. Maybe in her mind she was still the president of Ridgewater Bluffs. But for me, it was over. Because no matter what she tried next, she'd lost the only thing that had ever truly given her power, the fear of her neighbors. As the sun rose over the fields, painting the barn in gold light, I realized that the fight had never really been about bylaws or fines. It had been about dignity, about refusing to let arrogance masquerade as authority. And though the scars of the battle would remain, Ridgewater Bluffs had finally learned how to stand up straight again. This whole ordeal taught me something I'll never forget. Silence empowers bullies, but resistance exposes them. Patricia thrived for years because people were too afraid or too tired to challenge her. She weaponized that silence, turning neighbors into subjects. But the moment we stood together, when one voice became many, her power crumbled. In life, it's easy to ignore injustice when it doesn't knock on your own door. But one day it will, and the way you respond defines not just your future, but the future of everyone around you. Standing up isn't easy. It costs time, energy, sometimes even friendships, but it is always worth it. So if you've ever been bullied by a neighbor, a boss, or even life itself, remember this story. Fight back with truth and courage, and never ever let fear decide for you. If this story resonated, drop a comment below, share your own experiences, and subscribe. Together we can keep exposing the Karens of the world.